Hello, hello, and welcome to the Japan Zoominar at UC San Diego. It is March 8th, 2022, and it's International Women's Day. And today I will have one of Japan's most powerful international security political scientists, defense policy security political scientists with us. I'm Ulrike Schaede. Oops, I can't do this. Let's do this. I'm Ulrike Schaede, Professor of Japanese Business at UC San Diego and Director of the Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology. Just so that you know, you are finding yourself here at UC San Diego at the School of Global Policy and Strategy. GPS is an international relations and public policy school, and one of our 7 degrees is a Master's of International Affairs with a Japan specialization. If you're interested in our course offerings, please visit gps.ucsd.edu. And at GPS, we have JFIT, the Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology. It's our Japan Center, and you can find more information about our activities at jfit.ucsd.edu. If you go there, you'll find this website. And on the tab titled News and Media, you can also sign up for our JFIT San Diego Japan Newsflash, a bi-weekly newsletter where we try to combine information that you wouldn't find in the standard media and then some interesting observations about Japan and San Diego. Right next to it is the Japan Zoominar tab, where you can find upcoming and past events, because this event is recorded. Please note that the way we have set this up is that you can, as we speak, type any questions you might have into the Q&A box. But in order to secure your privacy, I will only refer to you by your first name when I read out your question. Alrighty, so then if you go to the Japan Zoominar site, you can find the JZ Gallery, which is a list of all of our recordings of past events, categorized into these 4 categories. And if you click any of these boxes, you get something like this, where you can then find our library. And so I hope you find that useful. Let me just say what's coming up next. Of course, today we have Professor Hikotani here, so I'll introduce her shortly. And 2 weeks from now, we will have Professors Patricia McLachlan and Robert Feldman to discuss Shibusawa Eiichi's legacy and Japan's new form of capitalism, which is Prime Minister Kishida's sort of program to write on in Japan. On April 5th, we will talk about changing employment norms and women in Japan's workforce with Professor Hilary Holbrook from Indiana University. On April 19th, we'll go back to the Ukraine, where we're going to probably start today, and have Sheila Smith from the Council of Foreign Relations. And on May 3rd, we'll talk about Japan's education system. Now, those of you who are in Japan, please note that we're switching to daylight saving time this week. So beginning March 22nd, the Japan Zoominar will start at 8 a.m. Japan Standard Time, not 9 a.m. So you have to switch to daylight saving time with us for this particular event. Alrighty, so I have Takako Hikotani with me. So let me stop my PowerPoints. This is how we announced the event when we designed it 5 weeks ago. But of course, since then, a few things have happened. So we're going to add the Ukraine into the title somehow. So let me stop the share. And there she is. Professor Hikotani, hello, and welcome
Hi.
to the Japan Zoominar.
Thank you so much.
So let me introduce you. A lot of people know you on this call, but I want to make sure that we understand the full breadth of your accomplishments. So Professor Hikotani is a professor at Gakushuin University in Tokyo. She's been there since 2021. She has an MA from Keio University in political science and an MA in political science from Stanford, as well as a PhD in political science from Columbia University. She was, and this I think for me is one of the more remarkable parts of your CV, Takako. From 1999 to 2017, she was associate professor at the National Defense Academy in Japan, and she has taught the various arms of the Japanese self-defense forces, Army, Navy, and so forth. And then from 2016 to 2021, for 5 years, she was the Gerald Curtis Associate Professor of Modern Japanese Politics and Foreign Policy at Columbia University. And I would be amiss if I don't mention at this particular moment that this coming quarter, Professor Hikotani will teach 2 classes at GPS here at UC San Diego, one on Japanese politics and one on Japanese foreign policy. And we hope that somehow we can make this happen, that you do this in person here at GPS. And we're all waku excited to have you. And I should also mention, last but not the least, that you're a Policy Institute Fellow at the Asia Society in Japan. Your publications include a number of very interestingly titled items: the Japanese diet and defense-making policy. Then the paper that drew my attention, Trump's gift to Japan, time for Tokyo to invest in the liberal order. You've also written on the Trump-Abe relationship and are currently working on the Biden-Kishida relationship. And that's, of course, what we're going to talk about in light of this increasing VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. So welcome to the Japan Zoomina, Professor Hikotani. It's great to have you.
Thank you so much, Ulrike. It is a great pleasure and it's to be here. I'm a big fan of the Zoominar series, so it's really waku for me to be here, but also doki doki because I don't know if I will try my best to make this a very interesting Zoominar as well. And today's topic that we discussed, I guess a month ago or so when we started talking about me participating, was just Japan-US relations under Biden-Kishida. And it's just that this past 2 weeks, the world has changed in a way. So I decided that we should focus, or I would like to spend about 10 minutes or so on what's going on right now in Japan with regards to Ukraine and how the Kishida administration is dealing with that. And it's not exactly a U.S. Japan issue right now. I think it's more about the G7 countries coming together, but still, I think there's implications for U.S. Japan relations going forward. So I'd like to open my talk with my take on what's going on right now. And my take basically is that I think this is really a turning point, and people have started to think about what this means for Japan. Initially, the argument was maybe this is like the show the flag moment in 9/11, that we have to do what we have to do for the alliance and say that Japan's on board. But then people thought it's actually more serious than that. So then people started talking about 30 years ago about how it sort of reminds us of the Gulf trauma, the Gulf crisis, and how Japan was allegedly criticized because we only gave money but didn't contribute, and the changes that happened after that. And I was actually reminded of that too, because 30 years ago or 32 years ago, I was a grad student working part-time at CNN Japan. And I remember translating when the missiles flew to Kuwait and so forth. So that I did remember. And for some reason, CNN, the newscasters are still the same people. So that was also something that I thought was reminding me of. But then is it really that? Because I thought about that, and politicians have mentioned in Japan about how we should do more this time because we can't do checkbook diplomacy. But I thought, wait a minute, I think this is different because we're sort of at a different and arguably more difficult place right now. Because one, US is not around in a way that they were in 1990. Two, we're talking about Russia invading another country, and not to say Iraq to be taken not seriously, but it's about another possible self-identified great power. Three, and then of course we're almost forgetting because we're so focused on Ukraine, but we were talking about how China is going to be the regional big power and what are we supposed to do. And fourth, we're not, the Japanese economy, it's not like we can write checks that easily. And so the economy itself, it was more optimistic than it is now. And of course we can have discussions, and I really enjoyed the Zooming out with Noah Snyder, by the way, but about how the strength of the Japanese economy, but we're not exactly at the same place domestically too. So what does this all mean? And I think finally, the most important thing is I think the world is looking at this as possibly a major challenge to what we thought about the post-war international order, post-war meaning post-World War II, where there's United Nations and the understanding that there's something about international law, and these kind of actions by Russia wasn't supposed to happen this way. And all of a sudden we're talking about possible escalation to nuclear war. So I'm thinking that this might be more for Japan, the end to the use of the word Sengo or post-war, on economic terms, in 1956, the economic white paper said we're no longer in the Sengoku post-war era. But I think we kept on using the word Sengoku forever. And there was a Cold War, post-Cold War. But I think right now we're at the stage, probably looking back in Japan, that we're going to have to rethink about our own security policy, and not just that, but like not to abandon what we have right now, but there's something to be said about the critical moment that Japan has to look at what they're doing. And that's sort of my hypothesis as of day 14 of the war. Hopefully it wouldn't get any worse, but you have Professor Smith coming to talk in April. So maybe even if I'm terribly wrong, you can kind of make up for my mistakes by listening to Sheila. But that's what I'm going to say, that I think it should at least be thought this way. And so just to cover, and just to, for the audience who may not be following what's happening in Japan as per the response, I think generally so far there was an article in the Washington Post about the surprisingly proactive, assertive policy coming out from Japan in response to the crisis. And I think that's what people tend to think. So let me go through what happened, what is the response, why is the response, and what I think as a takeaway from that, which explains where Japan is right now in terms of its policy. So overall, there was an initial reluctance to the response with regards to Russia policy, because after all, Prime Minister Abe had tried to improve relationship with Russia with China in mind, that he didn't want to counter both China and Russia at the same time. He had more than 20 face-to-face meetings with Putin, including meeting up with him at an onsen in Yamaguchi Prefecture. They gifted an Akita dog to Mr. Putin. Hopefully he is, like, the dog is able to calm his mind right now. But anyway, and also there was, it's really interesting to know that in the 2013 national security strategy that I'll get to, Russia was referred to as partner for regional security. And we really wanted to sign a peace treaty and to get the territories back. So there was initial reluctance to really be completely on the same page with the West because of the understanding that Japan has a special effort, or has been. But I think it was pretty clear quite long ago that it wasn't going to happen. We're not going to get the territories back. And I think this was sort of the nail in the coffin, that it's not going to happen. So the turnaround came about much quicker than I thought. And that we're much more on the same page with the other G7 countries. So far we have announced, and I just checked the Conte website, so I think I'm up to date on this, that we're going to assist with bulletproof vests and helmets. And the bulletproof vests and helmets are on its way from Komaki Airport on the Air Self-Defense Force jet right now. And also we're going to be imposing the similar level of financial restrictions and sanctions on Russia. And also we're going to be, and I guess this was also noted, that Japan's language towards Russia has been on the same page, or has increasingly on the same page. Like if I were to read it out, serious violation of international and major violation of the UN Charter, and the word aggression have been used. But if you look a step further, like deeper, I think there's interesting things to point out. One, this is not just a reaction, that this is more of an expression of what was happening in the past 20, 30 years in terms of Japan's changes in security policies, a reflection of that. One, I think some people, I was actually frustrated that we weren't making the announcements at the same time as the G7. But I think more likely than not, people were surprised that Japan was able to come this far more quickly than not. And that's due to the institutional changes around the Conte and the Prime Minister since 2001. And also the fact that some points that I referred to was done as a result of political initiative by the politicians. That's relatively new too. Two, what is the public opinion on this? One, in February 28th, the Nikkei said that 77% of the public worry about the possible spillover effect of the Ukraine crisis on Taiwan. So initially it was more about security. And I think right now it's more not just about security, but some level of, maybe, I'm not sure if the empathy is the right word, but it's more of a threat that is not just because of the spillover per se, that it might come to Japan, but 82% support tough sanctions, and that they think that Russia's change of status quo actions are a threat to Japan, 81%. And also, I think this is important, that it used to be the case when the 2014 crisis happened, that more Japanese people wanted Japan to have their own course of action, have its own policy towards Russia. Now 60%, 2% wants Japan to take the same action as the allies. So they were much more on the same page. And this is sort of in line with what the survey experiments that I've done with my colleagues, Professor Tago Waseda and Professor Horiuchi at Dartmouth, that the Japanese public is actually pretty pragmatic on these matters. So we ran an experiment during the Afghanistan withdrawal. And two things was interesting. One, Japanese public was willing to sustain casualties of the self-defense force if it was for humanitarian evacuation of Japanese nationals. And also two, the reputation of the US did go down, but it did not spill over to defense of Taiwan or the US Japan alliance. So the point to be made is that there's still quite a bit of people believe that US commitment is credible, but yet the reputation was going down. But people do make pragmatic choices about the alliance. And that, well, how this will change after Ukraine will be interesting. I think people are more reassured than not about what the US is doing, but they are aware the US and NATO is not helping Ukraine in a way that they might see appropriate given the tragedies that's unfolding on the ground. Also, the other thing about the domestic factor is that I think there's more domestic interest on the Ukraine crisis in a way that we didn't see before. You can say that the demonstrations are not as massive as you might imagine, but still quite a few people. It wasn't just Ukrainian nationals that was on the streets every weekend. The donations to the Ukrainian embassy has been 4 billion yen. And of course, 1/4 of that was by Mr. Mikitani from Rakuten, but it's not just Mr. Mikitani. 150,000 people actually donated for this cause. University professors, university presidents, 50 of them posted a joint statement about the crisis. That's something that's relatively new. Some business leaders have said that it's unthinkable to do business with Russia at this point, given their actions. That's something relatively new. And also, like at the local, very local level, city of Kyoto, which is sister city with Kiev, have announced that they will be willing to help out if there's something happens. And also, interestingly, Oizumi Machi, which is known for its high proportion of foreign nationals, foreign-born nationals, is saying that if there's going to be any evacuees or refugees, they're willing to accept in terms of housing and all that. They've come up. So that, I think, is very different. Three, it is also, we have to give credit to the administration period in which Japan engaged in proactive diplomacy with the other G7 countries and whatnot. So that, I think, is really important too. And that, I think, is sort of a, you mentioned my article, Trump's gift to Japan, but I think during that, Japan had to step up in various ways. So that was an unintentional gift, and that might be paying off at this point. But if you look at actual cases, it also shows some kind of limitations, but also changes in a different way. Helmets. So sending helmets is that, I think Germany was criticized for only sending helmets. And I think Japan's in a good place that they're happy that we're sending helmets and caliber vests. But I think, you could say that it should have happened sooner and it should have been more extensive, but I think it happened sooner than most people expected. And we'll see what happens with what other things that the self-defense force might be expected to do. And two, this is the more tricky question, which is the evacuees. The government announced that they're going to be willing to accept evacuees from Ukraine. They're using the word evacuees because they're not technically follow the definition of refugees. And as you may know, Japan is very strict about the definition and also acceptance of refugees. In 2020, only 1.19% of refugees that applied for refugee status in Japan got accepted, and that's only 47. And that was and in 2019, it was 0.42%. So Japan is very strict about refugees. So if Japan announces that we're going to accept more Ukrainian refugees, whether they want to come all the way to Japan is another question. But just if we accept like 1/10 of the families of the Ukrainian nationals, which there's 1,900, that's already 100, and that's already twice the many refugees we accept. So that could be not just like this case, but something that might be a game changer in terms of hopefully there wouldn't be any more refugees overall, but I think it might create a change that we didn't expect for that. And so that's the evacuees. And I guess the other question is why not for some issues. You might have, Notice that as of this morning, if I'm not missing anything, Japan has not announced pulling back from its investments in Sakhalin for energy, for Sakhalin 1 and 2, which is for oil and gas field development and LNG development. But already Shell has divested or announced that they would, but Japan has not. And as of last Sunday in the morning news show, Mr. Hagiuda, the economic minister, and also the METI minister, and also minister in charge of economic cooperation with Russia, which some people criticize for not canceling yet, said that we're in a very different place with Western Europe on this, that we're very dependent on energy, like 90% of energy comes from abroad. And also that since we invested so much in Sakhalin, if we just leave, somebody else might just take over. And we can't let that happen. And so we can't be as bold as other European countries. But we have to see what happens with that, because in fact, we only 3.6% of oil crude oil that we import is from Russia. And for coal, it's 68.2% comes from Australia, and Russia is 14.7%. And natural gas, which we think is major, is still more than 1/3 is from Australia, and Russia is ranks 4th after Malaysia and Qatar at 8.4%. So although it will be a shock, and there's a lot of former investment that's already there that people will be reluctant to pull back, is something to see. But I think that's where Japan has been taking a different stance. So looking ahead, what does this mean? And I think I would like to ask you, Ulrike, about the responses in Germany to the speech that was made. And I've already seen articles calling for Japan to spend more than 2% on defense. And that I do see that that's the way that people might interpret in Japan. But I think the important point is that it shouldn't be just defense. It shouldn't be just 2%. And there's other things that I think Japan might want to think about. And that could be read from the Schultz's speech that we can learn about. But just talking about defense, I think it's very relevant and important that we were just on the good start, had a good start with the US in terms of us having both countries looking at their national security strategy in 2022. So it was supposed to be expected to be more synchronized, and Japan was supposed to be doing more and buying more. And that was supposed to be reflected in the national security strategies of both countries. But I think at this point, in both countries, they have to rethink what they were supposed to write, what's going to be included. I feel bad for people who are drafting it, because I think they all have to rewrite a lot of what they've already written. But I think that's going to be what to look for. And it just so happens that timing-wise, it is good timing. It is the time that we're going to be looking at our defense budget. So we might see changes along the way. And also too, I guess this is actually something that I'm really interested in. So I have to say that what's going to happen with Japan's policy in terms of human rights is still interesting, and I think something to see with regards to refugees, and whether Japan will be more willing to impose sanctions on other countries when they see a human rights abuse. I don't really know. There has been a reluctance, but there has been what I mentioned, both the public opinion and also politicians who are more interested in these issues, who are proactive. Now it's such a wartime situation that it's really not, it's about human rights, but it's not just. But I'm interested in how this is going to evolve in the future. So I think, so the reason why I listed like this, because I think it's not just a matter of diplomacy, Japan showing the flag and being on the same page and acting quickly. I don't think it's just about spending more. I think there's something about being part of the international order that we benefit from, but the sense that that might no longer be taken for granted. And if that's the case, what is Japan going to do in an increasingly difficult environment for Japan going forward? And I think that's the reason why people look at Ukraine, not just because it's so tragic and people have sympathy and whatnot, but it's something that is very relevant for Japan going forward. And it does sort of shatter our expectation about what things are supposed to be happening and how things are supposed to be, and would require us to think about what we're taking for granted in terms of war and security. So sorry I went too long, but thanks so much for the opportunity. I'm really looking forward to all your questions. Thanks.
Oh, thank you very much. There's a lot going on here. I did not know about the sister city thing, so I made a little mark to that. That's very interesting. So the questions are coming in, and some of them are actually in line with what I would like to know. But let me just start with the actual topic of today, which is U.S. Japan relations, which of course are always important, right? But
Right.
so is this moment in time going
Mhm.
to be different?
Mhm.
And actually Byron has a similar question,
Mhm.
wondering whether Japan is still, you said Sengo, right? Sengo, the post-war, we're still post-war
Mhm.
Japan, except that we're like, what, 60 years later,
No,
right?
yeah,
Or whatever, more than that.
more,
So
more.
80. Okay, so it's no longer post-war, right? It's the 21st
No.
century, but when will Sengo end? And what would it take for Japan to make a break with the past? And Byron is thinking about like how Germany just did. And he said, okay, fine. So
Right.
this is different. We're on our own. The World War II is over and the rules of the games have just changed over the last 2 weeks. And so now we have to rethink this whole thing. What would it take for Japan to go back to the drawing table and say, well, maybe this whole Yoshida doctrine or whatever, and the whole U.S. Japan alliance as we used to know it should be reformulated?
Yes, thank you. I think the pragmatic thing for Japan right now is still to keep the formula in a way that we would want to keep the US Japan alliance. That seems to be the most pragmatically rational choice forward. That's how public opinion seems to appear. The difference is that it was interesting to note the Afghanistan response in contrast to other countries, that there was more of a expectation that it's a good thing for Japan because they took it not as the US retreating, but as a sign of pivot to Asia. And the US will be able to finally shift its resources to Asia. And of course, this happened. So I think right now there is an awareness that although it's great for Japan to see the US taking action in terms of a leadership role, and that I think the way in which the US is approaching its partners and sharing intelligence and all that is all good news, but is a strong awareness that it's not going to be the same in terms of how much the US be able to either be capable of and willing to take care of what's going on in Asia. And of course, the big if and the factor that we're not factoring in is what lessons China will learn from what's happening right now. Because some people fear that there's going to be this vacuum in Asia, or some others will say, well, China's going to say, well, that's really unpopular to be too aggressive about what you think is your claim, but what others would not. So maybe that's likely to happen. It's kind of too early to tell completely, but I think right now it's not that Japan or Japanese public, as far as I can tell from the public opinion polls, is saying, oh, this is completely lost. We have to completely independently defend ourselves. I don't think that's what we're looking at right now. I think it's more about working with partners, and that in terms of defense, possibly working with other countries other than the US, like Australia and the other like-minded countries. And it is interesting to see if we're supposed to have a Quad summit meeting in May. And I think it'll be kind of awkward because I guess there was already an online meeting, but India abstained from the UN vote, but India is part of the Quad. So that's going to be kind of awkward. But Japan was hoping in terms of US-Japan relations that Biden was going to visit Japan in May. And that would have been a boost for Mr. Kishida with the upper house election coming up in July. And also it was supposed to be a sort of a precursor to the G7 meeting happening next year. This year is going to be Germany. Next year, Mr. Kishida was hoping that it will happen in his hometown of Hiroshima. But that, I think, is all nice, but I think we're not talking about nice things anymore. And so right now, I think that Kishida's approval rating is not like is fine. So I think he's not that worried about this upper house election maybe, but it's just that right now, in terms of U.S. Japan license, everything is fine in terms of the working level, in terms of drafting a national security strategy. It's just that we are sort of in a different place all of a sudden. And the US would do its own rethinking, Japan would do its own rethinking. It will both look at what China might be thinking and do our own rethinking. But so to respond to the question, I'm sorry, I went kind of off track, but I don't think it's going to mean that Japan is going to suddenly going to go independent, because that doesn't make sense. It's not like we're going to be completely abandoning defense or increasing defense at a dramatic level. And if you ask Germany, I don't really know what you are like. It depends on what part of the German turnaround that you mean. If it's a question of 2%, maybe, but I think, as I said, I would want to see more realization that we need to recommit to, we shouldn't take the order that we're in for granted. And that's not just about the U.S. Japan alliance or the constitution that we have, but more about being a member of the international order or international system, including the UN.
Well, so I guess the difference with Germany, just so I'm not a political scientist, but I'm German, and so I have family in Germany, and I think the big thing that's happened in Germany over these last 2 weeks is that until last month, Germans were saying, oh yeah, okay, so the Bundeswehr, the military has 50,000 troops, and that's too many, right? And over the last 14 days, there's been this, oops, this is not so far. Poland is not that big. And we only have 50,000 troops, and this is not okay. And it's a sort of a complete rethinking, looking down the barrel of the gun, so to speak. And at a time when the United States is sort of in a bind, or depending on your point of view, unreliable, or whatever it is, can't move, won't move, shouldn't move for world peace, right? And so Germany is really with a back against the wall, but Japan isn't, right? And in fact, we do have a question from the audience that there have been other things, like there have been conflicts in the region, Korea and Vietnam, and and Russia, and Senkaku, and so on and so on. What do you think is different at this moment for the Japan, from the Japanese public perspective? What you mentioned earlier to me, that as we were warming up, that basically the Ukraine is on TV morning through evening, as if there were no other topic, and so they're clearly it's at the top of everybody's mind. What is different at this in the mind of the average Japanese TV viewer with this moment?
So yes, it's correct that we're not part of Europe. So it's not that distance-wise, we're that far from where the front line is, but we're not that far from Russia. So that's one thing, that it doesn't seem that far in a way, because Russia is our next door neighbor as well. But you're right that North Korea has been shooting lots of missiles towards our direction since January. And that is in the news, but it's not as in the news, because I think what the scenes that we're seeing from Ukraine is that it's not just what's happening to Ukraine, but it's the type of war that we're seeing unraveling, and the way in which we didn't think that kind of war was going to happen in the way we see it. And that, but it was for people who are, I think, older than me, that was what people were worried about during the Cold War, about tanks rolling into Hokkaido. So that's one thing that people might think. So it's not, it's just that wars happen. It's like the very basic way to put it. And that I think was a wake-up call. And that I'm all supportive of the US relative restraint in terms of not putting boots on the ground and whatnot. But I do think that people do also see the limits of what can be done. And also people are thinking about nuclear weapons in a way that did it before. And that whether that would happen, and that really shakes the Japanese public, because that reminds of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And also the nuclear, the power plants being attacked reminds us of Fukushima, because we are approaching the 11th anniversary. I'm not sure if it's anniversary is a good word. It's going to be 3/11 quite soon. So altogether, there's so many things that are not that far from us, and that it does remind us of different things we need to think about our own vulnerabilities. And so things have happened, but it's different because it's the type of war, and also it's sort of the limitations to what a US and its allies can do, and the sense of sort of I shouldn't say hopelessness, but the limits of what the UN can do, because everybody's doing their best to prevent the worst, and yet horrible things happen, and what can we do about it? And that, I think, is more relevant to us, and in a way that's different from the other crises we've seen.
So let me ask this could be a difficult question, I don't know, but the simple way of saying the question is are the self-defense forces ready? And that could be, that sounds like a simple question, but the more complicated question is this a military angle to this, obviously, and I guess the answer would be yes. It's large, it's well trained and so forth. But the more complicated question, of course, is it was actually Byron's question here, who says the public opinion increasingly supports, as you mentioned, the self-defense forces taking casualties to evacuate Japanese nationals, right? So that's okay. So that's on the books now. But that's still about Varibari Nihonjin while we're bringing our folks back. When will the Japanese public, do you think, support SDF casualties in the name to evacuate non-Japanese or to go and fight a war, or to basically to get ready to do more? What's the sense? Is this the moment? Is this that moment?
Right. Thanks for that question. So I'm doing a series of, I've always been interested in civil military relations because that's my topic, and also I taught cadets. So my cadets are now colonels, and I'm the last person, maybe alongside their families, that I don't want them to go in harm's way. But I've also seen the reality of that is something to be thinking about when you think about the use of force and whatnot. And I guess the question of whether the US self-defense is ready question is, I guess I have to ask for what? I think, and also for the evacuating people, there has been some changes to the legislation that it's not theoretically impossible to evacuate foreign nationals, because that was one of the things that came up during the Afghanistan evacuation, that we could not, we had to think whether it was okay to evacuate people who work for Japanese organizations and whatnot. And we didn't want that to be the case again. So there's been a review of that. So that might happen, but I guess it's the for what question. And if it's the question that you ask, I'm not as concerned. Concerned might not be a good question. I am concerned, but I think if it was for territorial integrity, I don't think that it's kind of a no-brainer that the self-defense force might suffer casualties. And so, but I guess the question is whether, if it's not for Japan's territory per se, or I guess whether it's really more about defending the way of life. And that's something that I've been always thinking about, that this is more when we're thinking about Iraq and so forth, that we are very close allies with the US, and that we might be doing missions alongside the US, but we don't really have the fighting for democracy type of idea. And since the US has kind of retreated from being very forthcoming in nation building and whatnot, maybe that's not something we need to think about. But I think in a way, I think in terms of thinking or readiness, in terms of mindset, I'm not that worried about territorial issues, but beyond that, I don't know is my honest answer. And in terms of readiness, in terms of preparing for possible attacks, in terms of the posture, and that I think will be what we'll be seeing in a new national security strategy. But there are important changes that's been already taking place. So there has been shifting of resources to the southern, southeast, west islands to a certain extent, and more posture, but working with the US in terms of its planning for possible contingencies. And that they are mentioning the word Taiwan and China more than before. So in a way, if you are talking about readiness for that preparing for contingency, I think that's already happening. But of course, some would argue that why aren't we spending more on Navy and Air Force, or Maritime Self-Defense Force and Air Self-Defense Force, and Ground Self-Defense Force and whatnot. But I think on that question, we are actually a little bit more cautious about territorial defense after what happened. So maybe people might be willing to pay more for the ground forces now, given what happened in Ukraine. But I guess it depends on what you mean by ready. And that.
Well, so Aaron has a follow-up question on this. And so Abe got a lot of, Prime Minister Abe, when he tried to change the constitution, he got a lot of pushback by pacifist groups. And so he's interested in learning where the pacifist groups stand in this moment in time.
Right.
Would they be more willing to say, yeah, we need to do that? Because there's a human rights violation going on after all, right? There is suffering, there is injustice, there's an attack on freedom. So with the pacifists, we're more willing to say, yeah, the world is changing. This is different. So maybe Japan should change the way we think about this. Just like the Germans are.
Right. So So one thing at the practical level, there has been changes in interpretation of the Constitution to the extent that I think if you are looking just from a defense perspective, that there's no practical need to change the Constitution right away. If Mr. Abe wanted to change the Constitution, it sort of did him disservice in a way, because I think the practical supporters for changing the Constitution for defense don't really have that cause as much as before they changed the interpretation of the Constitution to allow for limited collective self-defense. So that's one. But where are the pacifists, as I rephrased the question, is that actually brings up an interesting point that I skipped because we're running out of time on human rights, that right now the groups that are calling for more human rights, more attention to human rights, tend to be at the political level coming from the more hawkish wing of the LDP that are saying human rights because they're as a means to counter China. And the inherent domestic groups that have been the champions of human rights within Japan tend to not really get along with the right side of the groups within the LDP who are pushing for human rights agenda. And although it's not that but in terms of how the party configuration is right now, it's where the pacifists are not really in a good shape in terms of the seats that I have. So in a way, they're not increasing their support. And from what I see from public opinion polls just for this past 2 weeks, I don't think people are necessarily becoming more pacifist in a sense that we should not have more defense because that's just going to make us more vulnerable to attack. I don't think that's what people are worried about. I think people are more worried about not having enough defense to be able to protect ourselves. So that I'm in terms of the pacifists, it depends on how you define it. But and I think we have to see. I'm actually curious to know whether people's attitudes towards changing the Constitution or revising the Constitution might change after this. But I just can say we don't know yet. And so far, the public opinion polls show that we're sort of more in line with what other G7 countries are saying. And that is more that we might need to be more vigilant and try to protect ourselves. And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as a footnote to that, I mean, what may be different about this particular situation is that most Russians don't want this war either. And you know, the rock singer Sting just had a song in the 80s with a line titled Russians, and the line was the Russians love their children too, and he just redid it, right, and sang it at a concert, and so that I think the pacifists really are drawn into this particular the crass display of how there is no winnable war, right? And so maybe that changes things a little bit. I think, you know, we have a question on the refugees and the evacuees from both Jill and Barry, and I made a note myself on when you said that. And so the question is, what's the difference? And let me start while you think about, so what's the difference between what's the Japanese difference in definition between the two, and what is the public opinion between the two? And I can tell you from the German situation that that there are of course more than 1 million Ukrainians now that have evacuated into Poland, and that are going into they're walking west or driving west. And that's a really amazing situation at the border there. And I think part of the openness comes from the particulars of the situation, but also that the Ukrainians, of course, would go back as soon as possible. Right? They're not refugees. They just need shelter for a while until, you know, we can finish this, and then they can go back. But I'm wondering whether that's the definition.
Right. No, the refugee status and applying for that has more to do with the definition of refugees as interpreted in Japan has to be people who are persecuted due to race, religion, or nationality by its own country. And so in a way, that doesn't quite fit the current situation, and they're more better defined as evacuees. And I think this is more about like the mindset, because I think the government is thinking that there's not going to be that many. But once we make an exception, which I think we should. It opens up possibilities for other refugees or evacuees type of situation happening within this region. And so it's something that should be taken, like there should be more attention to what it might apply for other things, because one, the politicians who are pushing for this, including the former Foreign Minister Taro Kono and a new politician that was just elected, Mr. Shiozaki, is conscious of refugee situation occurring in a contingency in Asia. So we might need to be prepared for that. And also Japan itself needs to be prepared for that sort of overall in terms of other regions too, that this is something that we're very behind in to begin with, that we should improve upon. So it's not to take advantage of the horrible situation, but I think because of that, there are efforts to change the border control law, but it got postponed, or it didn't work out because there was a very, I think, unacceptable case of a Sri Lankan woman that died after being detained for 6 months. And that became very controversial. So it became very difficult to discuss border management issues overall. So, but I think this might lead to some changes in the law, because I think it is, even with a strict definition, I don't think it makes sense to have only 1% of for refugees, putting aside the Ukrainian evacuees. So that, I think, hopefully there will be, since there's more interest on this issue. But personally for me, since I'm not too sure how many would actually want to come to Japan and stay, I'm more interested in what Japan can do, possibly in Poland or other areas, including what the South Defense Force can do on the refugee crisis. And that, I think, we need to talk about more than just opening our gates. And so that's how.
Yeah, Japan is a little bit far away, one might think. So we have a whole lot of questions on China, which I've been holding back on because I wanted to finish the sort of the Ukraine part first and the European. So let's move to Asia, if you don't mind. Right. Our colleague Eve asked the following question. Yesterday, the EU foreign minister had a meeting with Wang Yi of China, urging China to act as a mediator to stop the war. Right. And so saying that the EU-China relation will depend on such action. So it's pretty tough. Is Japan communicating something similar to China, or what's going on here? So is this a sort of a litmus test for China's role in the global order? What's your view on that?
I don't know. I just had, there's been, people are looking at how China's interpreting the situation. And for Japan, we want China to learn the lesson or think that it's a bad idea to do what the Russians did, nor to think that it's like a good opportunity to fill the vacuum in a way, or to have Russia to be something of an ally that they can use to our disadvantage, because the worst nightmare for Japan always has been for the Chinese and the Russians to be very cozy. And that will be a major security consideration with Japan. So I haven't seen, like maybe I missed it, but I was watching something on China last night. So as far as I can tell, it's not that Japan wants China to be the mediator at this point, because I don't think that that like all of a sudden China stepping up to be a mediator is not the help. And one thing to just add in terms of what Japan is looking for, I found it interesting, maybe this is my personal take, that not that many people are questioning the support for the Ukrainians to fight back. Because I thought people might say they should just give up, but the Russians rule, what can they do? People are going to die more if we can. But I see fewer of that than I thought, because I thought that might be what the pacifists might say. We actually don't see, it's not that it's not there, but it's not as strong as I thought. So that together, I think some kind of a deal that China promotes might not be in the interest of the Ukrainian people. And that together, I think, might make it less likely for Japan to want China to sort of step up in the occasion and do something, although I'm not aware of what the Europeans are expecting China to do, because I wasn't aware of that.
Well, just strong arm from the other end, right? So yeah. So you mentioned in your opening remarks that this moment, we were, at least for a while, concerned would give China a license to invade itself, right? And so the Taiwan question comes up. Aki, asks, observing that the war in the Ukraine demonstrates how important the coordination is between allies and partners, right? Because we see a lot of that. How do you assess the current status of U.S. Japan Taiwan coordination? If not good, how should the three countries promote security coordination? Are we learning something from what's happening in Europe right now?
I haven't really thought about what's happening in Europe relevance, because I think the type of operations that we're going to be planning for is quite different, just in terms of what kind of thinking we need to be doing in terms of the contingency. But I'm not sure about the Japan-Taiwan, the triangular, but in terms of U.S.-Japan, I think it's really important that in the 2+2 readout, or the statement that was much more longer this time in January than the one that was issued before, there has been specific mentioning that U.S.-Japan together should not just ramp up its deterrence, but also to be able to respond. And I think the language used being respond is very important, because that suggests, and it has been reported, there has been more planning going on about how Japan and the US can together deal with a contingency in Taiwan. And that, I think, from the public opinion point of view, it's interesting that there isn't that much of like, why are they planning kind of question. I think people tend to think that, of course, they are planning, because after all, if something does happen in Taiwan, the US gets involved, the US forces are going to probably dispatch from US bases in Japan. They might want to use the Japanese bases that have now expanded to the other southern islands and whatnot. They might want to make their bases more resilient to Chinese missiles. So in a way, that is already in the discussion. It's reported to be discussion, and also is mentioned in the 2+2 statement that they're going to be improving the response. And so that, I think, in addition to the deterrent part, that suggests that there has been, I don't know if it's sufficient, I don't know if it's good, but I know that it's happening. And I think it's a good thing that it's happening.
So back to our original topic of Kishida and Biden. Are we in good hands here? I mean, we knew, or at least we thought we knew Prime Minister Abe fairly well. We could, over the years, he'd become, known. We know the face. Right. We trusted, or we felt that we had an intuition what he would do. Prime Minister Kishida is not that well known on that front. Can you comment a little bit about what it means to have Prime Minister Kishida in the office at this particular moment of time?
Right. So although he's probably not happy that he's not that known. He was a foreign minister for a very long time under Prime Minister Abe. So he has experience being a foreign minister, and that he was behind the scenes of making a successful President Obama's visit to Hiroshima, being from Hiroshima. What is the Kishida difference, so to speak? He is known to be the more dovish, being part of the more dovish faction within the LDP, which I think part of the reason why people like to compare 1990 with now is that that's when Prime Minister Miyazawa, who was also from the same dovish faction, made the decision to change how we use the self-defense forces, and they see parallels of dovish prime ministers actually accomplishing more. And in a way, I think Kishida has a different challenge than Mr. Abe, that Mr. Abe doesn't have to worry about hawkish criticism because people on the right liked him. So he can go soft on China, or be seen to be more soft on China, without being afraid of the hawkish criticism within the LDP. I think every time Kishida was seen to be more weaker in China, he's going to get the criticism from the right side, right wing of the LDP. And that could be his weakness. But on the other hand, he might have less resistance from people on the left or the more liberal wing, or it will be harder to criticize Mr. Kishida from the opposition probably. So we'll see what happens. But if we are going to see some kind of unexpected, that Abe did more liberal things than you think, because he didn't have to worry about the right wing. If Kishida is going to be able to do the same with the more hawkish tone, possibly he might turn out to be the more pragmatic and somebody who can make more assertive, or I don't know what's the right word, makes happen in terms of changes in Japanese policy, but we don't know. But his challenge is to pass the upper house election in July, which will pretty much, unless he decides to hold elections, 3 years, and that he might have the term. Because I think one of the things about Abe administration was that it was very long, and that's why he made sure that it was very long. That made it possible for him to make people remember his name, unlike the other prime ministers that most Americans don't remember. And it really will be up to Mr. Kishida whether he's going to be another revolving name or long-term to be able to make the Kishida difference. And so far, all I can say is that he's very eager to have that kind of chemistry that Abe and Trump allegedly had with Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden. But I think things are just very difficult right now, not because of COVID anymore, but how things have rambled. But I think he must be encouraged by the fact that the U.S. administration is very careful about being on the same page in terms of whatever they say. The announcements are always in sync and very much on the same page. And I think not necessarily because the U.S. likes Japan or Biden likes Schaede, but the U.S. needs partners in the region especially. And that I think is very important. That is really not about personal chemistry anymore. I think we need each other. And that I think should lead to a more constructive relationship going forward, or it's more that we can't really afford to disagree at this point. So we have to think about ways to be more cooperative going forward.
So as the regulars of the Japan Zoominar know, it's at this point the hour when I ask Professor Hugh Patrick's question. He basically told me that he always asks that, and he always asks that. So I'm sure he has done that with you already. So, but this moment in time makes his question very difficult. The question is, what worries you most? And I could tell you what the German answer to that question is, very obvious. But from the Japanese perspective, what worries you most in this particular moment in time?
Hi, Professor Patrick, first, if I may. I'm currently at this moment most important about the conflict escalating to something that involves nuclear weapons. So that's my concern. But I might be different than I don't know if that's what worries most people, but I do worry that what happening on Ukraine might lead to that. And I don't really want to think about what comes after, but that's what I'm really worried about. But just as a side note, I had this Zoominar, sorry I used your name, with my students. And we read Noah Schneider's piece in The Economist from a couple of Zoominars back. And I asked the students, what are they most worried about? And I cited, because he talks about internal, external risk. And they, out of 10 students, majority were most important, even within this current moment, were more worried about earthquakes. And so like natural disasters. And that, in a way, we're actually looking at lots of things on the Great East Asia or East Japan earthquake. So it's not surprising. But at the same time, I was quite surprised that even with everything happening on TV and what we hear, and I guess they might not watch TV, but still they're in the news and they're more worried about earthquakes, like a major earthquake happening in Japan, than something that's more related to war. So that's my.
That's very interesting. That they're worried domestically. And of course, as I said, I guess so the Germans are of course worried about the bombs. The Americans are worried about the nuclear war quite significantly, of course. And so well, now we're ending on a bad note. I need to change the order of this. So what makes you most optimistic? Right. What's the hope? What's the best case scenario here?
With regards to Ukraine or?
Yes. So you're.
Well, I don't like that. Is really difficult, but I don't really know how it's going to end. I wish I knew, but I don't know. And so the bottom minimum is that I hope we all survive. But I am hopeful that about what we're seeing in Japan in terms of more, not just for diplomatic reasons and for security reasons, but a level of empathy with the rest of the world, because I was kind of worried that in the past 2 years, Japan has such close borders. We were in like a virtual sakoku for a while, that I thought that might change people's mindset. And I do think there are some like still worries about that. So it seems so easier than I thought in many ways than close the borders. That was what people's favorite answer was. But I'm actually more hopeful that there do seem to be more connectedness and empathy towards what's happening in the world. And that if that changes Japanese policies for the better, I will be very happy. But right now, I think it's really hard to be optimistic about anything right now. So I guess that's like the really tiny silver lining that I see, that people are not taking for granted that we can live the lives that we want and that people have their livelihood secured. So.
Thank you. And I think that's true for Europe as well. That it might actually be unifying in a very interesting, unexpected way. And so, well, let's see what it brings. So thank you, everybody in the audience. There are some questions about the survey you mentioned. I will forward your questions, audience, to Professor Hikotani, and so maybe there can be some answers on these clarification questions. And with that, I'll let you all go. Class is dismissed. Don't miss us in 2 weeks from now. We will have Robbie Feldman and Patty McLachlan to talk about Prime Minister Kishida's new form of capitalism, and also Eiichi Shibusawa, who founded, of course, Hitotsubashi University, which is my alma mater. So I'll be very happy to talk about that. And remember, good folks in Japan, that because of the daylight saving time switch, it will be at 8 a.m. On the 23rd of March in Tokyo, which is 4 p.m. 22nd here in California. So thank you, Professor Hikotani, and thank you, audience, for staying with us until the end. And we'll see you until then. Take good care and stay safe. Goodbye.